All right, so welcome back to the second piece of Chapter 2. We're going to be talking about neuroscience methods now. So, previously on cognitive psychology, we talked about the subtraction method, and we talked about how we can use that to infer what's going on in the brain. Now, this particular video is going to tell you a little bit about the different kinds of tools that we have to do that. So, before we get into that, though, I do want to warn you about something called phrenology. You may know phrenology, you may have heard of it before. Essentially, what phrenology is a pseudoscience. It is kind of this fake science that was created in the early 1800s, I believe, and lasted throughout most of the 1800s. And the idea was essentially that different parts of your brain do different things, and that these different parts of the brain, depending on their size, tell you how much processing goes on in those areas. So there's a kernel of truth there, but the way that they preach this, the way they teach it, is not true. So essentially what they're arguing is that the different parts of the brain do different things, and that happens to be true. But then they argue that depending on these things' size, that can tell you about a person's character. So you can have a part of the brain that is like the logic module, or the creativity node, or the honesty bump, and these different things. And those things don't exist. That's not how the brain works. The brain, instead, is much more like a complicated, really complex weaving of neurons communicating with one another. So when we talk about logic is not just one particular spot in the brain. It is distributed throughout throughout a lot of the brain. The same for creativity and honesty and decision making and all this stuff. There's not a specific little node that you can look at. That's very, very rare for a lot of our behaviors. There are some key structures, though, that we're going to be talking about that are very specialized. So like the amygdala, which we talked about last video, and the hippocampus. Both of those do have very specialized functions. But for the most part, that's not really how the brain works. So, for example, someone who is into phrenology, you might see something like cautiousness. Okay, we got cautiousness right here. So you'd be able to measure someone's scalp. And if they have a bump in their head, then that can tell you that, oh, it must be because they are very firm, or they're very cautious, or they're very hopeful. Or if they have a dent in their head, or a little bit of a recession in their head, then they would not have hope, or not have spirituality, or not be able to imitate others, or not be able to carry a good tune, or they'd have a bad appetite, or that they were. Well, you know what conjugality means. I'm not gonna say that out loud. That's embarrassing. Or that they have poor self-esteem. These are all different things that you can measure on someone's scalp. That is not true. These seem to be all just kind of pulled out of nowhere. Like, I don't know where they came up with these. Even if you were to try to, for example, if you were to try to get self-esteem, it's definitely not going to be in the parietal lobe. If anything, it'll be, up in this area, but it'll not just be a single module. Anyways, you get the idea. This is bad science. But there are a couple of ideas that are good about phrenology. Phrenology would basically be used as a way to discredit people and objectify people by saying that, oh, this person is not successful. They're poor and they're in poverty because this part of their brain or whatever. All that stuff's bogus. None of that stuff is true. But there are a couple of good things about phrenology, primarily that it got people thinking about the brain having different parts that have their own functions. So, when we think about hearing in the news that this part of the brain does this, I want your first gut reaction to be like, wait a second, is this another example of phrenology? Because when people report this stuff in the news, they have a tendency to kind of treat it like phrenology. So when we talk about neuroimaging methods, there are different ways that we can scan the brain, and really there's not exactly a best way to scan the brain. There are lots of different ways, and they all have their advantages and disadvantages. So there's not going to be one single best one. There can be a worst one, probably, but it really depends on what it is you're interested in. So if I were to give you on the exam, like, here's your research question, which neuroimaging method would you use? I would want you to be able to pick one, but more importantly, defend why you picked that specific one. Because your defense of it, your rationale, is more important than the specific ones you chose. Because, again, all of them have advantages, all of them have disadvantages. Some of them can be used incorrectly, some of them can be used effectively. All right, so think about that. Think about why this method and not the others. We're going to look at two different approaches. One is going to be the lesion method, and the other is going to be the neuroimaging method. We're going to start out with lesion methods. Lesion methods, the word lesion is just a fancy way of saying damage. That is a damaged part of the brain. There's something that's happened to the brain that has damaged it in some capacity. That could be temporary, it could be permanent. It could be something like a stroke. A stroke is a lesion in the brain. It damages and destroys the tissue in the brain, and typically that results in maladaptive or impaired functioning in some way. Oftentimes you see people who have a stroke have difficulty moving one side of their body, or controlling their facial expressions, or speaking clearly and things like that, or putting words together. We're going to be looking at all these things later in the semester, especially when we talk about language. So it can be a permanent thing. It can be through surgical removal too, but it can be temporary. So we are going to look at one example in particular in which you can have temporarily the ability to turn on and off parts of the brain. So what lesion studies do is that they tell us what part of the brain does what, because you can look at how behavior is before and after the lesion. So if your brain is just fine, and then it's damaged in somewhere, maybe because of a stroke, maybe because of head trauma, and then your behavior is different, then you can assume that the area that was impacted must have something to do with that particular behavior. And these studies are super important because they tell us a lot about what the brain does, and oftentimes the effects are very clear. One of the famous examples of this is Phineas Gage. Phineas Gage, if you haven't heard of him, which would be surprising because he comes up in a lot of psychology classes I find, Phineas Gage was a railroad worker who was actually... Well, yeah, I'll tell you and then I'll show you pictures. He was a railroad worker who was working on the railroad, and the way that they would do things back then is that they would try to make big holes to put posts in and things like that. So they had dug part of a hole, and what they would do is they would take a metal rod and they would pack down the explosive materials so that they could ignite it and then blow out a section of a hill, for example. So, Phineas Gage was doing that. He had a railroad spike, and he shoved it down into this hole to try to pack down the explosive powder, but he didn't have the correct material between covering the powder. So basically, his railroad spike ignited the powder, it exploded, and that pole went flying away from the explosion. And unfortunately, and this is where it gets graphic, unfortunately the dude's face was between that explosion and where the pole was going. So the pole went straight through his head. But miraculously, the dude lived. And so I'm going to, and before I show you the picture, I'll very quickly tell you that he'd lived for several more years afterwards. And basically, he had changes in his behavior. And so we know a lot, or we came to know a lot about here's what these parts of the brain do, because after they were destroyed for Phineas Gage, we saw how it affected his behavior afterwards. All right, so if you're squeamish, move ahead 30 seconds or so. Otherwise, I'm going to show you a picture. So here is Phineas Gage's skull, and here is a recreation of probably where the pole basically went through based on his skull. This is a picture of Phineas Gage a few years after his accident holding a huge railroad spike. And so he lost a huge part of his brain right in the prefrontal cortex, and that damaged his ability to do a lot of things, which you could probably guess based on the last video about what they were. He had problems regulating his emotions. He had problems with profane outbursts. He would be prone to yelling. He had bad manners. He had an inability to kind of regulate his impulses. It changed parts of his personality, which means that, this area of the brain must control those different pieces, or those different parts of behaviors, those different mental processes. All right. If you're interested in Phineas Gage, send me an email, and I'm happy to talk more about Phineas Gage. TMS. So or transcranial magnetic stimulation. You might think, like most people, I don't feel so comfortable destroying people's brains for science. Well, buddy, let me tell you, I'm right there with you. I don't agree with that at all. Our university won't let me do it. I've asked. But you may think that, okay, that sounds inhumane, and you're right. That's why we don't do it to people. We don't remove parts of people's brains. That would be inhumane, unethical, etc. So we have developed a way in which you can temporarily create a lesion in someone, and it's completely safe. It's called transcranial magnetic stimulation. You can find a link to it elsewhere in this PowerPoint. But essentially what TMS is, it is a very, very powerful centralized magnet. And what it does whenever you turn it on is it temporarily scrambles the brain activation. It essentially turns all of those neurons on, or as if they are on, which means that you lose control over that part of your brain. And it's for a very short time, just a matter of, a second or less. And so if you put the TMS wand over that part of the brain, it will disrupt it. So if you go up to a part of the brain and you zap it with this magnetic coil, and that person is unable to speak, then you can probably infer that that area that you disrupted probably has something to do with the ability to speak languages, or the ability to move their mouths, or whatever. You get the idea. And so using this can tell us a lot about what areas of the brain do what, and in a much more humane way than, waiting for people to get into accidents, or, surgically removing parts of people's brains. So there's a video in which you can check some of that stuff out. Here's kind of what it looks like, where you have this wand, and it has a very powerful magnet that is going to disrupt these areas of the brain, and then we can see how this guy's behavior is affected as a result of that. So there are some good things and bad things about this. The bad thing primarily about TMS is that it doesn't tell you what area of the brain is active. It just tells you what area of the brain is deactivated, right? But it also can only really get the surface level of the brain. So you can't do things like explore the amygdala, or the hippocampus, or the thalamus, or the midbrain, or the cingulate cortex. These different things that are, in the middle of the brain. You can't study any of that. You can only scramble the stuff that's on the surface. So that's a tremendous disadvantage for TMS. Another example of a lesion study is split brain patients. Split brain patients, if you're not familiar with this research, it is fascinating. You can find a video right here that I highly recommend. It's actually a very old video, but I love it because it is hosted by basically the guy who discovered this phenomenon. So it's kind of cool to see his reaction to these different patients. But essentially what split brain research is, and the book goes into more detail about it, but essentially back in the 50s, people were having big bouts of epilepsy, as they have for all of history. Epilepsy has been a human condition. And some neuroscientists suspected, you know what? I bet we can get rid of these tremendous seizures if we isolate the different hemispheres of the brain. So there is, we have these two hemispheres of the brain, and there is a bridge, a bridge of neurons called the corpus callosum that is going to link these two hemispheres. So these neuroscientists thought, well, you know what? I bet if we cut this, it'll help us treat epilepsy, because instead of having a grand mal seizure where the entire brain is affected, it'll be localized to just one hemisphere. It can't travel over. And they were actually kind of right. That the split brain procedure did actually help a lot of people, probably save some people's lives, because their seizures were not, as intense as they used to be. They weren't as life-threatening as they used to be. But there were some side effects to this that became clear after several months of research. That the way that these people perceive the world seem to be different than the way that most people perceive the world. And this would go on to kind of be called hemispheric specificity, which is a really fancy way of saying that this means that different hemispheres do different things. That the left hemisphere has its own specialization, the right hemisphere has its own specialization. Now, whenever I say that, you'll see a lot of people say, I'm a left brain learner, I'm a right brain learner. That's not a good way to think about it. That's not exactly how the brain works. It's an okay shorthand, but it's not scientific. So if you are really artistic, that does not mean that you're going to have more activation in one hemisphere or the other. That's the data do not show that. As an example of what kind of perceptual differences these split brain patients were having, so here is an example, and I highly recommend the video that is posted in the notes. It'll do a much better job of showing this than I can do. Let's say that both of these are split brain patients. They're looking ahead. And they're looking right here in the center of this projector. And on the left side, they're going to be presented a spoon, and on the right side, they're going to be presented a fork. And so the left hemisphere is going to see this fork. The right hemisphere is going to see this spoon. So, and that's just by the way that our eyes work, is contralateral. The left hemisphere is going to see the right visual field. The right hemisphere is going to see the left visual field. So, if you were to ask this individual, what did you see on the screen in front of you? He would say, a fork. Why? Because we know that a lot of language takes place in the left hemisphere. We know that now. If you were to ask him, what was on the other side of the screen? He would say, I don't know. I have no idea. And then if you asked him, well, you know what I want you to do? I want you to put your hand over here and feel around until you find the thing that you saw. He would reach in here, and he would touch all these things, and he would come to the conclusion that this right here is what he saw, this spoon. Because essentially, this spoon is going to go over to this hemisphere, where language is not a specialization at all. And so if we were to look over here, you can kind of see this guy's picking up the spoon. There's many more kind of interesting ways in which this manifests, but we don't have time in this course to really talk about that stuff too much. Maybe in your physiological psychology class you might talk about it a little bit more. That's split brain research. This is also an example of a lesion study because the surgical connection, or the surgical removal of the connection of these two hemispheres. All right, so let's talk very quickly about neuroimaging techniques. There are three of them that we're going to be talking about. The first is EEG, or electroencephalography. That's the only time I'm going to say it, because if I try to say it again, I'm going to screw it up. It's most commonly referred to as EEG, and you've seen these before. They are those kind of caps that you put on, and they have like the electrodes on them. That is EEG. And EEG is a way of measuring the electrodermal activation in the brain. In other words, the parts of the brain that are active are creating those action potentials, which are electric. You may remember from the previous video. So EEG is going to help identify where that electrical activity is taking place throughout the brain. So it's measuring electrical activation. And so the nice thing about EEG is that it's very, very fast, that it is a non-invasive measure, which means that you don't have to open up somebody's skull to do this. You can just keep that cap on. And it's also something that you can use for people while they're sleeping, while they are awake, while they are in a coma, etc. That you can use these. They're usually used a lot in sleep studies and stuff like that. But there are some downsides to this. It's not used a ton. It is also kind of cheap. But the downside to this is that it is very weak and a very noisy signal. Essentially what that means is that the results that you get are often very messy. It can be very hard to interpret without lots of really, really precise calculations. And even then you have to be careful about the assumptions that you're making. So the noisy signal that you're getting there is because all these different areas of the brain are active at once, and so the EEG is picking up all of that and trying to make sense about where exactly that electrical activation is coming from. And just like TMS, it's really hard to see what's going on below the surface. It's hard to measure electrical activation there too. So this is a method that's good if you're looking for something that is fast and non-invasive. Not so good though if you're looking for something very clear and direct. Actually, when I say direct, I mean direct in its results In terms of neuroimaging, this is a very direct way of measuring brain activation because it's measuring the electricity. So here is an example of an EEG. You can see this cute little baby's got on his thinking cap, which is going to be measuring the electrical activation throughout this baby's brain. And so you would, here's also some examples over here of sleep. So you can kind of see how that electrical activation changes from when we are awake to when we are in deep sleep. And so that kind of information is brought to us through EEG. There are two other ways of neuroimaging that I want to talk about, and they are hard to talk about because they're very, very complicated pieces of technology. And they are PET imaging and fMRI. PET imaging is essentially you're going to inject a radioactive tracer into someone's blood, and then you're able to measure using different kinds of measures of radiation where what parts of the brain are active and are circulating blood the most. fMRI, on the other hand, which is, so we always hear MRI. You may have gone to a doctor and had an MRI on your knee or your ankle or whatever to look for a break or a crack. F just means that it is functional, which means that you are looking specifically at activation, not just structure, but what's going on in the brain. And the way that this particular way works is that it is measuring changes in the blood oxygen level. So it's not even really tracing the blood, it's not tracing the electricity. Instead, what it's doing is it is measuring where we suspect the blood is in the brain, and we suspect that where the blood is also where the neural activation is. So it's very indirect in that way. So you are kind of looking at blood flow, but you're really just looking at oxygen flow, which is carried through different blood cells. So it is an inference that is being made. And I feel like a lot of people don't know that, because if they did, then I think that our conclusions, when you hear about this stuff in the media and in the news, would be much more reserved. Alright, so here's an example of PET imaging. This is the kind of data that you would see where it's very, very blurry, but you get these nice, clear signals. And the advantages here, the pros, are that you are measuring chemical reactions, so you're able to get a good, accurate representation of where that blood is. The downside to this, though, is that because you have to inject somebody with a radioactive isotope, it can only be done a couple of times a year for an individual, which means you can't come in and get scanned over and over and over, because you can't expose somebody to that much radiation without potentially putting them in harm's way. And another big downside, especially for cognitive psychology, is the latency of it. In other words, it takes about 30 seconds for the blood to really circulate and carry this radioactive tracer. But a lot of the mental processes that we're interested in happen much more quickly than that, right? Think about trying to think about, I'm trying to think about what I'm saying here. If we're interested in memory, we would need to be remembering something for 30 seconds. If we're thinking about language, we need to be able to say something for 30 seconds. If we are thinking about hearing, we need to listen to something for 30 seconds. You get the idea. That's not very realistic, because so much of what we do is, so quickly happening in the moment that this may not give us a good representation of what true behavior looks like. And also, it is wildly expensive. We're talking several $1,000s for a single scan to do here. I want to say that the isotope, the chemical tracer, the radioactive tracer, alone is like $7,000 per person, so it can be very expensive. But you can see some differences here. You can see, like, for example, the dark red generally means that there's more activation here, and the blue means that there's less activation. Very interpretable. The final neuroimaging method is fMRI, so functional magnetic resonance imaging. Essentially, I told you a little bit about that already. The benefits of it is that they provide very, very strong spatial resolution, which means that they give us tiny little pixels of the brain, which is helpful. It's a very clear, detailed map, especially compared to PET imaging. And the temporal resolution is not bad either. It's, between 1 and 4 seconds. Sometimes people say that it's actually between 2 and 6 seconds, but much better than the 30 seconds plus that it would take for us to do those other tasks with PET imaging. There's no radiation because it's all brought to us through the power of magnets. It is simple and relatively cheap. I say simple and relatively cheap. That's just in comparison to the other methods. It is still very expensive to hold an MRI machine, which is part of the reason why our university doesn't have one. And because there's not a risk using radiation and things like that, there's not going to be any real risk of longer experiments. So it's okay to do those things over longer periods of time or for repeat testing and things like that. The disadvantages, though, is that it is a really indirect, imprecise measurement of blood because you're really just looking at blood oxygenation level. There's different brain differences which can mess with the data. There's lots of different ways that can mess up the results here, too. And so here's kind of what an MRI looks like. You have a person sitting down in the middle of a scanner coil where magnets are going to measure the blood oxygen levels in her brain. So which method here is best? Really, it's up to you in your particular experiment, and it depends on how you go about measuring or researching your experiment. Some of you, if I were to ask you, give me tell me what you would use if you were trying to figure out what brownies smell like, what areas of the brain are active when we smell brownies. You could ostensibly use all of these to try to measure that, but it really depends on your rationale for why you chose one over the other. So if I ask you this on the exam, that's really what I'm looking for, is your defense of it. All right, so that is it for this particular section. We're going to jump in for a final video. It's going to be much shorter than the previous two, talking about a couple of examples using neuroimaging. Bye.